Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Today we welcome back our friend Martin North to talk about the unemployment rate, how it's measured, how it's changed over the years, and what it's currently doing in Australia. So how are you, Martin?
Pretty good. How you going?
Pretty good, thanks. And we've been keeping an eye on all these different metrics each month, but this is one that I wanted to unpack a little bit further because it's not just the US where we have this measure that has changed over time. So how has that changed over time for the viewers at home?
Yeah, so we're talking here about the unemployment statistics, right? And essentially, pretty much all Western economies report in some way the number of people who are unemployed. But of course, the devil is in the detail as to how you actually define unemployed. And if you go back 20, 30 years or more, essentially it was people who were signing up for unemployment. You'd automatically be counted as unemployed. Um, but it's changed. So basically now the definition of unemployed is you have to be you have to be actually seeking work actively. In other words, you have to be demonstrating, writing letters and all those sorts of things on a continuous basis. And secondly, if you work for even 1 hour in 1 week, that is sufficient to define you as employed. And that's the one that I think is quite concerning because essentially what it does is it takes the real true number, I think, down quite a long way. And if I give you an example of that, there is some statistics that Roy Morgan produces, which is an alternative way of measuring the unemployment rate. And what you can see on this chart here is that they have an unemployment rate of 8.6% compared with the seasonally adjusted ABS data, which is around 5%. So they don't seasonally adjust, Roy Morgan doesn't seasonally adjust theirs, but it's just a lot higher. And frankly, I think that Roy Morgan number, which is consistent with other measures, by the way, produced unofficially around the world, is a much fairer representation of unemployment. And the other factor, of course, is underemployment. So effectively, underemployment is those who would like to get more work but can't. And that's a lot higher than the unemployment number, particularly on the ABS series.
Yeah, and we see Shadow Stats in the US does a lot of this work, but it's great. I wasn't aware that Roy Morgan are doing such great work as well. So for people at home, that I want to talk about those statistics a bit more. So we have the working age population, but then straight away we get into the people that are retired, unable or disabled is an interesting one as well. Martin, I want to ask you about them. There's plenty of people that have disabilities that still work, and then it's that not looking for work, which is the one that's a real kicker.
Well, it is, yes. And the other point to make there is that I know from my own surveys that there are people in 2 or 3 jobs essentially trying to generate enough income to be able to cover their outgoings and still not necessarily satisfactorily achieving that goal. So in a way, just the raw number of the number of people who are looking for work, doesn't tell you what's really going on. You need to also understand that many people who are in work are actually still not generating sufficient income from that work to be able to actually cover the costs. And that's a discussion then about, well, what should the hurdle be? The lower rate at which people are paid. Should it be, the current one, or should it be higher, or should there be a fairer rate of pay? And those sorts of things come into it as well. Then, as you say, there are other categories of people who, what tends to happen is that people, as they move up into their 50s, find it harder and harder and harder to get work. But there's also quite a spike amongst the younger end of the population scale as well. So people, in their 20s, and particularly males, young males, a lot of those are actually, unemployed as well. And so you have this weird sort of cross-generational problem where you have a dip in those 30 to 50. It's quite low there. But then you've got more older people and more younger people still trying to get work. So I don't think the overall, 5% number really gives you a very good representation of what's truly going on.
Yeah, that 5% number, anyone that works an hour or more. And I think as we have an aging population that are going to be retiring later and people retiring without a lot of wealth, they're going to have to look for those hours. And so the number that interests me is that participation rate, where we have the total labour force divided by that working age population. That's down somewhere like in the mid 60s, which is, I think, a bit more revealing, isn't it?
Well, it is. So the the participation rate tells you what proportion of the population is actually actively engaged. And as you say, as people move into retirement, by definition, they then work less or don't work at all. So the participation rate might go down. But it's also gone up a little bit compared with a few years ago. So some would say that the participation rate doesn't look too bad at the moment. But then, of course, you then go back to, it goes back to the definition, right? So if you have a narrow definition of employed, there are more people who are participating in the workforce, therefore the participation rate goes up. So damn lies and statistics, I'm afraid.
And that's probably something that's a conversation for another day about, for the first time in history, this aging population and how does such a small relative percentage of participants pay for and fund retirees and healthcare and all that sort of thing.
Well, the intergenerational issues that you're talking about are absolutely amazing. So, older people go into retirement with mortgages. So about 45% of people who go into retirement now have a mortgage. Used to be 10, 15%. That's a big deal. And then, as you say, the sort of rotation in the population age demographics means that essentially we're going to have more people at the top end and less below. Although in Australia, because we've had such strong migration, that demographic shift is not so strong as somewhere like Japan, for example, where Japan is a very good example as to how this could play out, where they have a massive number of people who are older, supported by a small working population. And frankly, the economy struggles because of it.
Yeah, and that's one of the books I've got on the shelf there, the Harry Dent's Demographic Cliff, where he does talk about these phenomenon, but Australia is relatively more protected. So a few of the other more narrow meanings I want to talk about, Martin, they talk about frictional unemployment and how efficient your economy is at getting one person from one job to another. And I think that's really going to change with the gig economy, and that's going to impact how people report whether they're employed, because that's very week to week doing these gigs.
Well, that's right. So it goes back to, works an hour a week. It doesn't tell you whether it's actually, sort of a gig role. And many people have 0 hours contracts or work for odd, digital companies here and there, and they're counted. So the quality of the work and the nature of the work and the longevity of the work is a critical question, particularly if you think about the economy coming off. So we know that construction, there's a million plus construction workers in Australia, but about 20% of them are now looking for work. That's gone up a lot. We also know that retail, some of the retail segments are also looking a little bit tight now. So some of those are beginning to lay people off. So wherever you look, there are more challenges in the unemployment number. So my expectation is that we're not going to see this number continue to go lower. We will begin to see it rise, even on the narrow basis that the ABS uses. And that's going to have a very significant impact then on the broader economy, because essentially what it means is that people may not be able to switch from job A to job B. They may spend more time looking. And as you say, then the friction of moving actually increases, and that creates more difficulty.
Yeah, and there's a few other definitions here. We have that cyclical, up and down the business cycle, then seasonal. We have more fruit pickers in summer and whatnot. Underemployment and hidden. We've touched on that a little bit today, but I think hidden is one that's interesting, because, as you say, that 5% number, the RBA are starting to hang their hat on that a little bit, aren't they? Saying, well, unemployment's really strong, but I think beware, because when something's at record lows, it tends to only be able to go higher. And if I lose my job and I have to go work a few hours a week doing Uber just to pay some bills, I'm really hidden, aren't I, from these central policymakers?
Yeah, they're correct. So a lot of those part-time jobs and small jobs will not actually show up, particularly also if those people who are actually in the cash economy, in other words, they get paid cash rather than actually by bank transfer. And there's still a proportion of people employed who are getting paid by cash, although the government's trying to bear down on the so-called black economy for all sorts of reasons, including the one here of trying to make sure they grab the tax that they should be getting. But it is a concern. And the way I think about it is simply this, that if you actually look at what the politicians are saying, which is, isn't it great? Unemployment's down at 5%. We've created 1 million plus jobs over the last N years, right? That's what they keep saying. But there's little about the quality of those jobs. As, for example, a lot of them are in the healthcare sector and not paying very well. There's little about the fragmented nature of work these days, particularly around Uber and those sorts of things. And then there's little about the uncertainty ahead because of the fact the economy is coming off. So all of those factors, I think, are critical when you actually come to really try and understand what the economy is doing.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I just recorded a bit of an episode with my thoughts about the cashless society and where this is going and how Bitcoin and gold and that might play a role. Another video I want to do is the inflation measures as well. But I just want to talk to you about that, those construction jobs. And I was having a conversation with friends the other day about tradies, and I think, a good tradie, that's a great job. I'm not knocking that at all, but there's a lot of tradies now that are making 150, 200 grand a year, and it's just this glorified building construction industry. We see the renovating shows on TV. So I'm a big believer that whether it's a chart or the real world, things come back and find their equilibrium. So do you think that's going to happen in our service sector versus our high paying jobs?
Well, I think it could well. We know that some of those construction workers were doing very well because there have been big infrastructure projects as well as the big retail and residential construction boom. Of course, residential construction is coming off very quickly. We're seeing much lower levels of building approvals. And it's interesting that, in fact, on my channel, I have a number of people who work in the construction industry, and they said, "Yeah, actually, we don't have any prospect of work other than what we've, where we are now. So they're going to have to try and find alternatives." I also said in my small business surveys, and again, it's the construction sector that's coming off, particularly in New South Wales, and a little bit also in around Brisbane and around Melbourne as well. So these are big and important changes. And then the question is, well, what do these people do? And, do they find something else but with less income? Well, that often happens. So suddenly you find there's a preponderance of people offering gardening services, for example, and, other self-employed services other than what they were doing previously. So all of that is part of this funny rotation that's going on. And the thing that I would highlight is, one, the average income growth over the last 5 or 6 years has been flat. There's been no real growth if you adjust it for inflation. And secondly, a lot of people are now earning less than they were 5 or 6 years ago because the nature of their work have actually changed. And so we've got this tremendous set of pressures on households simply because the working environment has completely transformed. Digital and all those things are part of it. And I don't think policymakers really have got their head around this sufficiently well and prefer to just praise the 5% number and say, see, everything's fine.
And what do you think we're going to see once that number does start to tick up if we have this slowdown? Is it that they're going to have to admit that things aren't rosy?
Well, we're already seeing some recognitions. The GDP number was down again, of course, as you know previously. I think that it will be a slow rise. I don't think it's going to be a sort of dramatic over the next 3 months. But I think if you come back end of the year, you'll see it a bit higher. And I think next year it will be higher still. And now there will be things that they may do. Maybe there'll be stuff in the budget, which was later today, of course, to try and stimulate some activity in the employment sector. A lot of infrastructure projects may help, new infrastructure announcements, that may help. But these are all long-term, strategic things, and it won't necessarily help in the next 6 months. So I think we're going to see the unemployment rate wobble up. And I think, therefore, the narrative that they've had about this being a really strong economy will be questioned again.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us so much today, Martin. Great thoughts as always.
Good to talk to you. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.